good morning, and thank you for making the time. Let's talk about bullying. It's often said that it's very subtle. You can't easily pick it up, and oftentimes the victim isn't aware that they actually are being bullied. What are the signs to look for?
Absolutely. I think, you've kind of raised a really great point in that when people think of bullying, you kind of think, playground bullying where it's very overt, it's aggressive, it's kind of open. But in the workplace, it happens in a more subtle manner. So some of the signs of workplace bullying, which people are not aware of, is things like someone giving you an unreasonable amount of work, unreasonable amount of deadlines, particularly where there's no justification for it from a business perspective. It's things like isolating you. So, for example, a bully might, forget, for example, to invite you to particular meetings. They might exclude you from particular tasks which you should be included in. It's things like withholding information that you're required to do your job. So basically trying to sabotage your tasks or your output. It could also be feeding you the wrong information, obviously in an effort to sabotage you. Stealing credit for your work, that's also part of bullying. Ignoring, fun enough, is also a form of bullying. So a bully might, for example, come into a room and greet everybody else but ignore you, or not make eye contact with you in a meeting. That's a form of bullying. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Wow. Talk to us about how you address bullying then, particularly if your boss is involved.
Yeah. I think one thing actually, the Workplace Bullying Institute in the US actually found that 70% of bullies are actually someone who is higher up, so a manager or maybe a manager above that. So in many cases, there are a lot of power dynamics that come to play, which actually then makes it difficult to confront, particularly if it's someone, that has authority over you. So in terms of what should you do, if you kind of come across, or if you actually realize that you are being bullied. So if you feel comfortable and if you feel safe, you may confront the bully, but that is not recommended if, for example, you might not feel safe, and it might actually result, in the bullying, getting worse, or you being actually further victimized in that regard. So what you can then do is the law actually, bullying falls under harassment, in the Employment Equity Act. So you are actually able to report it to your Human Resources Department, to a union if you've got a union within your workplace, and failing which you can actually take the case to the CCMA if your organization has not sort of, taken adequate steps in order to resolve it. And in fact, some employers actually can be held to account for not creating a safe environment for a person that's being bullied, particularly if the person can prove that they've brought it to their attention but they've not taken adequate steps.
You're getting into a very interesting area there where you talk about the employer's responsibility. But before I get into that, how do you go about gathering evidence, given that it is very subtle, as we started out explaining this issue of bullying? How do you gather evidence? Yeah,
so first and foremost, as is with any form of sort of, harassment or grievance, document everything. So dates, times, what was said, what was done, particularly if you've got, some physical evidence. Maybe it was, it happened in an email. So document everything so that at least
print out those emails.
Yes, exactly. Print out the emails if they are, so that at least, when you take it, you sort of have facts, you've got dates, you've kind of have a timeline on it. Witnesses is a bit of a tricky one, because sometimes there are people around you that may observe this behavior, but they might not always be willing to sort of come forward and formally sort of, formally state that, they have observed it. So if you've got people who have witnessed, who are willing to come forward, that's something that you can use. But the reality is many people do not actually sort of want to formally involve themselves in such a matter.
Talk to us about the involvement of the Human Resources Department. What's their responsibility here? And importantly, should companies develop a policy around bullying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, in terms of good practice, having a policy that is well communicated, and I think raising awareness is almost like a proactive way to do it. So don't wait sort of, for grievances or for the issues to escalate. If employees are aware, of what bullying looks like, what the process is, if there's transparency and openness to that, then they are more inclined to know that, okay, the company actually, places importance in creating a safe work environment.
Are there companies that you think have this policy in place?
Yes, I mean, look, so whether they have it or not, the Employment Equity Act, which is the overarching sort of labor law, actually stipulates that it's something that a company should deal with, whether they're proactively doing it or not. So in essence, you have some companies who will then explicitly have a bullying policy. They might even have awareness campaigns to make sure that, everyone is well aware. And I think it kind of, gives an indication that, they are serious about creating a healthy workplace environment. So even if your HR department doesn't have an explicit bullying policy, you can still take it, because the law actually, speaks against, people being being harassed within the workplace.
At this point of our conversation, I actually want to introduce the Twitter poll that we ran overnight. And the question we asked there was simply this. Bullying in the workplace is in the spotlight. So officials have testified at the PIC. So the important thing here is that the question we wanted to know was, have you ever had to resign from a workplace due to being bullied? And the results are very interesting, Fiona, because 46% said yes, 45% said no, and 9%, only 9% said HR helped me. What does that say about the involvement of the Human Resources Department? How involved should they be in matters like this?
Yeah, I mean, your poll, I think, is actually very congruent and reflects to some research which I also saw, which is quite scary in that they did some research in terms of people who are victims of bullying, how did it stop? And in most of the cases, there's actually a higher ratio of the victim ending up leaving or sometimes being pushed out than there is the probability of the person sort of being brought to book, which is, most unfortunate. But in essence, the Human Resources Department should be the custodian, and in fact, they should actually be actively trying to make sure that the workplace is safe. But, there's a lot of things, I think, factors which then end up making, people, sort of bullies get away with it. And I think in many cases, people just end up leaving, because it becomes unbearable and then they end up sort of moving on or even being forced out in some cases.
And you'll find that those HR directors sometimes possibly want to cozy up to the bosses, and so they worried about their jobs themselves.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you look at the fact that a lot of times it happens by people in management or senior positions, those dynamics obviously come into play, and it becomes about power relations really, sometimes than about doing the right thing, although it shouldn't be.
Let's talk about the emotional aspects of being bullied at work. How does it manifest emotionally? Do we see perhaps productivity becoming less and less? And at home, how do people who are bullied cope in the home environment?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really great point. So companies, should care actually about, not having a safe working environment because of the impacts that it has on productivity. So some of the symptoms, in terms of where, bullying has escalated is whereby feelings of anxiety. If it happens for prolonged periods, it might actually lead to depression. It might actually even lead to physiological effects. So feeling sick, feeling stressed, having sort of health-related matters, associated with that. It decreases productivity because victims of bullying a lot of times have a higher prevalence of being absent from work, because it's kind of unbearable to come to work, or, they're sick or trying to take some time off. And what happens is productivity goes down, the company loses money, and there's also a high prevalence of the person leaving, so turnover increases. So even people who are not sort of, bullying targets, when they're observing that, the environment, is toxic, who end up leaving because generally people don't want to stay, within an environment where, people are allowed to sort of get away with that type of behavior.
Final question, and very quickly on this one, Fiona. Why does one become a bully? And is it possible that you may be a bully but not even be aware that you are a bully?
Absolutely. Some of the bullying is actually so unconscious in that the person is actually not aware, but in many cases they are. So bullies are quite known for being very manipulative, and they sort of, know how to sort of work things around and get away with it. But in essence, the reason for bullying is sometimes it's low emotional intelligence. So the manager or the person who sort of is bullying doesn't know how to deal with their emotions or to respond effectively. So they end up then, being overly aggressive or using some of these tactics. Another reason is actually insecurity. The bully feels insecure. And what's interesting is a lot of people think, being a victim of bullying means you're sort of the weak one in the pack, but it's actually not. People become targets of bullies sometimes because they're actually strong in some sort of sense. So the bully gets intimidated by their position, their influence, the great work they're doing. So they actually then sort of go on a campaign to, to try and destroy that person. Yeah.
Very interesting conversation indeed. Thank you very much for coming through. Fiona Martin, she is an industrial psychologist and career coach.